In Good Morning Monster, Catherine Gildiner does something pretty incredible. She basically turns her consulting room into this theater of transformation. And over 5 chapters, we get to follow 5 heroes as they go head-to-head with the monsters of their past and start to reclaim lives that were stolen by neglect, abuse, and even cultural erasure. This guide is going to take a deep dive into each story. We'll unpack the big moments, the therapeutic techniques, and the psychological insights that make these journeys feel so universal and at the same time so profoundly personal. So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to journey right into this theater of transformation. First, we're going to meet Laura, the parentified child. Then we'll get into the story of Peter, the man in the attic. And after that, Danny, the cultural orphan. From there, we'll uncover the story of Alana, the glamorous survivor. And we'll wrap it all up with Madeline, whose journey is really going to help us pull together the biggest takeaways from all of these powerful accounts. All right, so first up is Laura Wilkes. She shows up to therapy, chronically ill, and she's blaming it all on work stress. These recurring herpes outbreaks. But the real trigger? Well, it's buried 3 decades in her past. Back when she was just 9 years old, Laura basically became a surrogate mother to her own siblings. Her father vanished for 7 months, her mother just sank into depression. So Laura, a kid, she was stealing food, managing the household bills, and just burying her own hunger, both for food and, for love and attention. So yeah, Laura's background is just one of total parental abandonment and chaos. And how does a kid respond to that? Well, she develops this intense hypervigilance, this perfectionism. But you have to understand it's not about ambition, not at all. It's a desperate survival strategy. It's kind of like carefully trying to build a house of cards in the middle of a hurricane, just hoping it'll keep you safe. Her journey in therapy started off pretty rocky. She was really resistant, seeing it as a, quote, luxury for the weak. So Gildiner used something called narrative reconstruction, asking Laura to retell her childhood stories in the present tense, which really ignited all these buried feelings. Her big breakthroughs came from what's called somatic awareness, learning to connect that tension in her chest with unresolved grief. And then came these reparenting exercises, where she'd actually envision her adult self comforting her 9-year-old self. I mean, what a radical act, right? And it was what finally started to soften that armor she'd worn for so long. Laura's story really shines a light on how needs that go unmet in childhood can just morph into these compulsions when we're adults. Her perfectionism wasn't ambition. It was just this leftover instinct to feel safe. And what's amazing is, as she started to allow herself moments of imperfection, those herpes outbreaks, they started to subside. In owning her vulnerability, she gets her power back. So while Laura's childhood void was emotional, our next hero, Peter, he had to endure a void that was terrifyingly physical. See, his successful career as a famous guitarist just couldn't drown out the memory of the years he spent locked alone in an attic. For hours at a time, toddler Peter was just exiled up there, above his parents' restaurant, starved of eye contact, of lullabies, even of words. His coping strategy was to dissociate. He'd just retreat into mental silence whenever his emotions got too overwhelming. So Peter's whole background is just defined by the after effects of that extreme sensory deprivation. He develops this chronic dissociation, which is really a way of disconnecting from your own body. And as an adult, this shows up as this deep internal turmoil. We're talking severe intimacy issues, sexual dysfunction, and chronic insomnia. Peter's therapeutic journey kicked off by looking into his past. Gildiner gently helped him connect his anxieties now to that childhood terror of being unseen. She used body-oriented techniques, like slow breathing, to help him reestablish a sense of actually living inside his own physical self. His breakthroughs were pretty amazing. He did mirror work, where he'd practice saying compassionate things to his own reflection. And there was this one dramatic emotional exposure session where he used his guitar in therapy as a bridge between his mind and his body. Peter's journey really shows how trauma can silence not just your speech, but your entire self. His recovery isn't just in his head, it's somatic. It's about learning to feel the pulse in his hands as he strums his guitar, and learning to recognize tears not as weakness, but as signals of life. At just 5 years old, Danny Morrison was torn from his Cree family and put in a residential school. In that school, speaking his own native language was an offense punishable by beatings. Priests molested him, nuns just ignored him. His very sense of identity was systematically dismantled, and it left him adrift between 2 worlds, neither of which he could ever really call his own. Now, to really understand Danny's pain, we have to look at a painful piece of history, Canada's residential school system, which was designed for forced assimilation. This system didn't just traumatize one child. It created what's known as intergenerational trauma, a wound that gets passed down through the loss of language, rituals, and family bonds. So his therapeutic journey had to start by validating this collective grief, by affirming that his suffering wasn't just his alone. It also brought in traditional healing methods, with Gildiner supporting him as he reconnected with a local elder and cultural ceremonies. His breakthroughs were really powerful. He wrote a letter to his childhood self, and then he led a storytelling circle for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous participants, turning his personal healing into a moment of communal reckoning. Danny's story really underlines that some wounds aren't just personal. They're woven into the very fabric of history. So his therapy becomes an act of cultural justice. It demonstrates that healing can ripple outward, helping to mend some of those deep societal fractures. Okay, next, let's meet Alana Matthews. She is the embodiment of success, a corporate executive who commands boardrooms and graces magazine covers. But behind that flawless facade, a decade of sexual abuse by her father, Art. And her mother's denial and complicity just made the betrayal that much deeper, teaching Alana that love required her to just completely annihilate herself. Alana's background is just one of devastating trauma from incest, which was made so much worse by her own mother's betrayal. To survive, she became an absolute master of compartmentalization. She built a wall between her professional success and her internal pain, and just used her work as a shield. Her therapeutic journey involved some heavy-duty stuff, like trauma-focused EMDR to get at those blocked memories. And then she had this narrative confrontation where she wrote and read a letter out loud to her father. Talk about turning secret shame into spoken power. Her breakthroughs were absolutely profound, learning to integrate moments of joy and laughter without guilt, and finally setting boundaries by choosing her own self-care over her career. Alana's metamorphosis is just a masterclass in courage. You see, naming the monster is only the beginning. The real heroism lies in rediscovering pleasure and rest. Two things her father had basically taught her would kill her. So while Alana's monster was a person, our final hero, Madeline, fought a monster that was created by words. Every single morning before school, her own mother would greet her with the phrase, "Good morning, monster." Just that single phrase. It created this background noise of chronic low self-esteem. Madeline's perfectionism wasn't about a drive to succeed. It was a desperate attempt to outrun the monster she was told she was. Her therapy focused on dismantling those harsh self-judgments, using things like inner child dialogues and mindfulness. And her breakthroughs weren't big, dramatic confrontations. They were quiet, gentle victories, learning through self-compassion and setting boundaries to finally be able to tell herself, "I'm enough." Madeline's story is such a vital reminder that monsters aren't always actions. Sometimes they live in the words we hear, and maybe more importantly, in the words we tell ourselves. You know, when you look back across all 5 of these incredible journeys, some really powerful themes start to pop out. First, there's trauma as narrative. Each patient shows how these unspeakable events become a kind of fractured life script, and how therapy is all about rewriting it. Second, body-mind integration. We saw healing really emerge when the brain and the body came back together, whether it was Laura's physical illness getting better or Peter reconnecting with himself through music. Then there's cultural reckoning. Danny's story showed us that personal recovery can actually kickstart collective healing. We also saw the power of naming. Confronting the monster, like Alana did, breaks its hold. And finally, everyday heroism. Recovery isn't some single flash of light. It's a tapestry of small, courageous choices, just like Madeline's quiet acts of self-love. When it comes right down to it, Catherine Gildiner doesn't just diagnose, she witnesses. Her compassionate presence is this constant reminder that therapy isn't some kind of mechanical fix. It's more of a sacred collaboration, just one person bearing witness to another's hidden wounds. So, what can we really learn from these stories of healing? Well, Good Morning Monster is both an invitation and a beacon. It asks us to face our own darkness, and it shows how through courage and connection, we can emerge into the healing light.